The decision no one heard. Everyone thought they understood Keanu Reeves. Hollywood had turned his quiet presence into something mythic. His restraint became legend. His gentleness became headlines. His generosity became viral clips shared millions of times by people who believed kindness was something rare, something miraculous, something that only existed in short, beautiful moments. To the world, Keanu was comfortingly predictable. The man who gave up his seat. The man who listened more than he spoke. The man who never seemed to want more than what he already had. But predictability, when worn too long, becomes a cage. And on a gray Lowe's Angels morning, beneath a sky that felt unusually heavy, Keanu Reeves made a decision that would quietly, irreversibly, and devastatingly shock the two women who knew him not as a symbol, but as a man. Alexandra Grant. Sandra Bullock. The decision did not come with an announcement. There were no headlines, no urgent calls, no public statements. That was never how Keanu moved through the world. His choices were not designed to be seen. They were designed to be lived. This one unfolded the same way. In silence, in privacy, in a place where no one was watching. Keanu sat alone at a small cafe near Silver Lake, the kind of place where the tables wobbled slightly and nobody cared who you were if you spoke kindly and cleaned up after yourself. He wore a dark jacket that had softened with age, his hair slightly unkempt, his posture relaxed but inwardly guarded. To anyone else, he looked like a man killing time. But inside him, something had already broken its old shape. He wasn't scrolling. He wasn't distracted. He wasn't waiting. He was finishing something. Not an email. Not a call. A conclusion. For months, Keanu had been listening more carefully than ever before. Not to praise, not to rumors, but to the unnoticed spaces between conversations. To the way certain people spoke only when they felt safe. To the way others were spoken about when they weren't present. To the way power moved through rooms without ever introducing itself. And the more he listened, the harder it became to remain comfortable. Across the city, Alexandra Grant stood alone in her studio, sunlight catching on unfinished canvases and half-written lines. She had woken with the now familiar sensation that something was misaligned, not wrong, not broken, but shifted. Keanu had been quieter than usual lately, not distant, not cold, just inward, as if he were carrying a question he didn't yet have language for. Alexandra was not afraid of silence. Her art was built inside it, but this silence felt different. This one had weight. It pressed gently against her thoughts. It lingered in the spaces between ordinary moments. It asked for attention without demanding it. And miles away, Sandra Bullock stood under bright set lights, laughing with crew members the way she always did, wrapping warmth around exhaustion, offering steadiness where stress usually lived. She had known Keanu for decades, through youth, through fame, through reinvention, through grief and success and the strange weight of being watched by millions. If anyone could sense a shift in him, it was her. And she had. Not dramatically, not urgently, but enough to register. He hesitated before answering questions now. He lingered after conversations instead of exiting them. He listened with a kind of gravity she hadn't seen in him before, as if something inside him was recalculating. None of them knew yet what he had already decided. The breaking point hadn't come from scandal, or betrayal, or loss. It had come from observation. Weeks earlier, Keanu had attended a small community arts fundraiser held in a rented downtown hall. No cameras, no entourage, just folding chairs, uneven lighting, donated snacks, and people who were working far harder than they were being acknowledged for. Alexandra had contributed artwork. Sandra had supported quietly, anonymously. Keanu had come simply to listen. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then he began to notice who wasn't being heard. He saw how a young organizer, competent and prepared, was repeatedly interrupted by a board member who hadn't bothered to learn her name. He watched volunteers, mostly women, mostly people without influence, explain the same ideas again and again only to hear them rephrased minutes later by someone else and praised as original. He noticed how credit floated upward while labor remained grounded. None of it was dramatic enough to challenge openly. And that was precisely what unsettled him. Later, as he stood near the exit, a man recognized him and laughed, clapping him lightly on the shoulder. "Good of you to show up," the man said warmly. "People like you make this stuff legit. People like you." The words were meant kindly. They landed heavily. Not because they insulted him, because they revealed something. That worth was borrowed from visibility. That respect increased with recognition. That kindness from the powerful was celebrated, while endurance from the powerless was expected. Keanu smiled, he thanked him, he went home. And he didn't sleep. In the days that followed, the pattern appeared everywhere once he began to see it. In meetings, in casual conversations, in the subtle hierarchy of who was allowed to speak without interruption. He noticed how Alexandra's intelligence was often softened into support, how Sandra's strength was praised only when wrapped in charm, how dignity was mistaken for compliance. For most of his life, Keanu had believed humility meant stepping back. Now he wondered if stepping back had become another form of silence, and whether silence, when practiced too long, eventually protects the wrong things. One evening, Alexandra finally spoke what had been resting between them. They sat together at home, city light diffused against the windows, dinner untouched. Her voice carried no accusation. "You're somewhere else," she said gently. "I don't need every thought, but I need to know if you're carrying something alone." Keanu didn't answer immediately. The instinct to shield her was strong. He had always believed love meant absorbing weight quietly. But this weight refused to stay contained. "I'm afraid," he said at last, softly. The word felt unfamiliar. Not of losing something, of realizing that staying comfortable might mean letting things stay wrong. Alexandra didn't interrupt. She never rushed truths. She allowed them room to arrive fully. "I've spent my life trying not to take up space," he continued. "But I'm starting to wonder if the space I leave empty gets filled by voices that don't care." Her eyes softened, and behind the softness lived concern. "What are you thinking of doing?" she asked. Keanu exhaled slowly. "Something that will disappoint people who expect me to stay quiet." That night, Alexandra lay awake long after he slept. She understood conviction, she also understood cost, and she knew that decisions born from conscience rarely arrive alone. They bring consequences, ripples, distances. Sandra learned differently. They met for coffee days later, an old ritual that had survived decades. At first she joked, teased him about his seriousness, then she stopped. "Okay," she said, "what's going on?" Keanu stirred his cup, watching the surface tremble. "I think I've been wrong about something for a long time," he said. Sandra studied him. "I thought staying out of things was humility. I thought neutrality was respectful, but neutrality helps the loudest voices win." The air between them shifted. "What are you planning?" she asked. Keanu met her eyes. "I'm stepping away." "From what?" she asked, though she already knew. "From platforms that profit from silence, from spaces that perform inclusion while quietly punishing anyone who questions it." The words settled heavily. Sandra didn't fear for his career. She feared what this meant. Keanu Reeves had been proof that the system could look gentle. And now he was removing himself from that illusion. "Do you realize what that changes?" she asked. "Yes," he said, "that's why I can't ignore it." Neither woman tried to stop him. They were too honest. But both felt the ground move beneath them. What none of them yet understood was how deeply this decision would test their relationships, their security, their definitions of resilience. Because the moment Keanu stopped playing the role assigned to him, the world around him would begin to reveal how much it had depended on his silence. And this time he wasn't stepping back. He was standing still. The consequences of Keanu's decision did not arrive with confrontation, headlines, or dramatic ultimatums. They arrived the way winter enters a city without snow, first unnoticed, then undeniable. At first, nothing appeared different. His phone still rang, messages still arrived, conversations still happened, but the temperature inside them had changed. Where warmth once lived, there was now formality. Where familiarity had flowed, there was now caution. Invitations were not withdrawn, they were delayed. Opportunities were not canceled. They were quietly rescheduled until they no longer existed. It was subtle enough that anyone could dismiss it as coincidence, but consistent enough that Keanu could not. The system was not punishing him. It was recalibrating around him, adjusting its posture now that one of its most comforting symbols no longer aligned neatly within it. Hollywood had always been fluent in subtext. Word traveled not through statements, but through assistance, through closed-door dinners, through the small tonal shifts that only insiders recognized. Keanu Reeves was taking space. Keanu Reeves was rethinking. Keanu Reeves was on a different path. None of it was said with hostility. That was what unsettled him most. There was no villain to confront, no cruelty to resist. Only the gradual sensation of being politely moved to the edge of rooms he had once entered freely. He attended the same quiet gatherings he always had, supported the same small causes, spoke with the same humility, yet he began to notice how conversations slowed when he approached, then restarted with forced brightness. Compliments became careful, even ceremonial, as if his presence now required justification. He was thanked excessively for simply being there, the way people thank someone when they are unsure whether that person still belongs. At home, Alexandra felt the change before Keanu named it. Not because he complained, but because the energy around him shifted. He became more inward, more reflective, as if every interaction required examination. He spent longer hours walking alone, reading, sitting without distraction. When he spoke, his words carried intention, not heaviness, but deliberateness, as though he were choosing language not to express himself, but to prevent misunderstanding. Alexandra admired that steadiness even as it unsettled her. She knew too well the cost of integrity in creative spaces. She had lived it quietly, watching her own work misunderstood, softened, sometimes sidelined because it refused easy framing. She had learned to navigate those costs without naming them. Now she was watching the person she loved walk directly into them. One evening, rain threading down the windows and the city blurred into abstraction beyond the glass, Alexandra finally voiced what had been forming inside her. She did not accuse. She did not dramatize. She asked him simply whether he was prepared for them to let him go. Keanu looked at her fully then, not with doubt, but with a sadness that surprised even him. Not sadness for what he might lose, but for the confirmation of something he had hoped was untrue. He told her that he believed they already had, only without saying it aloud. The truth of it sat heavily between them. Alexandra felt it settle deep in her chest, not as fear, but as recognition. Loving someone like Keanu meant loving someone who would walk away from comfort when conscience demanded it. That had always been one of the reasons she loved him. It was also the reason worry lingered now, not as panic, but as a quiet companion to her thoughts. She told him she did not want him to mistake resistance for clarity, that sometimes the world punished people not because they were wrong, but because they were visible in a way that disrupted comfort. Keanu listened, nodding, acknowledging the wisdom without retreating from the resolve. He told her he could no longer accept kindness that depended on someone else's diminishment. That sentence followed her long after he fell asleep. It echoed through her studio the next day as she worked, through the conversations she replayed in her mind, through the memory of young organizers, unheard voices, the subtle choreography of power she too had witnessed for years. Integrity, she realized, was not solitary. It rippled outward, touching everyone connected to it. Sandra experienced the shift differently. She heard it first in tone. A producer she had known for years joked lightly during a phone call, remarking that Keanu seemed to be on some moral journey. The laugh that followed was too quick, too edged to be harmless. Sandra didn't mirror it. She asked a neutral question instead, something safe, and the answer confirmed what she already sensed. Keanu's decision was being framed not as principled, but inconvenient. At another meeting, his name surfaced in passing, the speaker lowering their voice slightly as if referencing a delicate subject. "He's still a great guy," someone added quickly, the way people defend those they are already distancing themselves from. Sandra felt anger rise, not explosive, but focused. She had survived long enough in the industry to recognize when a narrative was being gently reshaped. Keanu was no longer being used as proof that the system could be kind. He was becoming a reminder that kindness could challenge comfort. She called him that night. She did not soften her words. She told him plainly that people were uncomfortable, not because he was wrong, but because he was making them visible to themselves. Keanu listened quietly. He told her that was what he had feared. Sandra paused, then told him something else with equal clarity, that he was not alone, and that he should not allow anyone to convince him he was. What hurt Keanu most was not the distancing from power. It was the change in ordinary interactions, the way conversations now came with caution, the way curiosity had been replaced by management, the way people spoke to him as though he were fragile rather than resolved. One afternoon, at a small community workshop he continued to support, a young volunteer asked to speak with him privately. Her hands trembled slightly as she explained that she had heard about his decision, not through headlines, but through quiet conversation. She told him she wanted him to know that it mattered, even if no one with influence said so. She said it made it harder for her to ignore what she had learned to tolerate. Keanu felt something tighten in his chest. In that moment, the delayed calls, the disappearing invitations, the unspoken distance crystallized into something clearer. The system might not applaud him, but the people it had trained to stay silent were watching, and they were learning that restraint did not have to mean surrender. Still, doubt found him in the quietest hours. Late at night, when the house was still and Alexandra slept beside him, Keanu lay awake, questioning himself. Was this humility or ego disguised as sacrifice? Was he helping or simply withdrawing? He replayed conversations, examined motives, searched for fractures in his resolve. Self-doubt, he had learned, was not weakness. It was the cost of choosing a harder alignment. Alexandra sensed those doubts even when he did not voice them. One morning, as they sat together, coffee cooling between them, she placed her hand over his and told him gently that he did not have to prove anything by suffering, that his worth was not measured by what he relinquished. Keanu looked at her with tired steadiness and said he was not trying to suffer. He was trying to stop pretending that comfort equaled goodness. In that moment, Alexandra realized something that shifted her own unease. Keanu was not running from the world. He was standing still while it moved away from him, and that distinction mattered. The true test arrived when an opportunity once assured to him quietly vanished. No explanation, no confrontation, just absence. It was the kind of disappearance designed to provoke reconsideration, to pull him back into alignment through loss. Keanu felt the sting. He would not deny it, but beneath it, unexpectedly, was relief. The decision, painful as it was, had clarified his values in a way success never had. Sandra heard about it through the same informal channels that delivered all uncomfortable truths. She called him immediately. She told him they believed this would make him reconsider. She told him they were betting on his kindness turning into compliance. Keanu was silent for a long moment before replying that kindness without boundaries was not kindness, it was permission. Sandra smiled when he said it. She told him she had been waiting years to hear him articulate that truth. What neither of them yet fully understood was that this quiet stand was already exposing something deeper. Others, inspired or unsettled, were beginning to feel the pressure of choosing. The silence surrounding Keanu was no longer empty. It was charged, and within that charged quiet something was gathering. The story was no longer about what he had stepped away from. It was about what his stillness was making visible. The world was beginning to respond, not with noise, but with adjustment. And adjustment, when it spreads, is the first sign of change. By the time the third month arrived, the silence surrounding Keanu's decision had transformed from something passive into something structural, almost architectural, as though invisible walls were being constructed around him while he remained standing in the same place. Life on the surface still appeared unchanged. The city glittered, sets buzzed, new projects were announced, conversations still carried ambition and humor and urgency. And yet Keanu felt increasingly as though he were observing it all from behind glass. This was the real cost of stepping out of alignment with power, not confrontation, not even resistance, but omission. You were no longer argued with, you were no longer persuaded. You were no longer invited into the spaces where influence gathered. You were simply edited out of the story, removed from circulation without announcement. And omission, he was learning, was far more effective than rejection. What unsettled him was how gently it happened. There were no slammed doors, no raised voices, only a soft recalibration of proximity. When he entered rooms, people remained kind, but their kindness had become managerial. Conversations were warmer at a distance. Familiarity retreated into courtesy. He was spoken of more than he was spoken with. When his name surfaced, it was often paired with reassurance. He's a good man. He means well. He's on his own journey. Language that sounded respectful while quietly placing him elsewhere. The system was not discrediting him. It was contextualizing him. And in doing so, it was diluting the intention behind his choice until it resembled harmless personal reflection rather than ethical refusal. Sandra recognized the tactic immediately. She had watched it happen to others over the years, had even experienced versions of it herself. When someone's stance becomes uncomfortable, their conviction is reframed as temperament. Their boundaries become phases. Their clarity becomes sensitivity. Sandra heard the shift in meetings, in offhand comments, in the subtle way Keanu's decision was now being narrated by people who had never asked him what he meant. He was becoming the subject of interpretation rather than the voice of his own position. And interpretation, she knew, was power. It allowed the uncomfortable truth to be softened into something unthreatening. It allowed people to admire him without confronting what his choice implied about them. She called him one night with urgency she did not attempt to disguise. She told him that people were beginning to speak for him, that his silence, once protective, was now being used to reshape the meaning of what he had done. She told him that narratives were forming, and none of them were neutral. Keanu listened carefully, absorbing not only her words but the concern beneath them. He had always believed that avoiding spectacle was a form of respect, that not positioning himself as a symbol preserved the integrity of his actions. But he could feel the paradox tightening. By refusing to speak, he was allowing others to define his silence in ways that protected their comfort, and that, he realized, was its own form of participation. The realization unsettled him more than the withdrawal ever had. He had not stepped away in order to be mysterious. He had stepped away to be honest, and honesty, when left unattended, could be repurposed into something else entirely. He felt himself standing at a new threshold, one that did not demand retreat but presence, not the presence of publicity but the presence of clarity, and clarity, once offered, could no longer be managed by others. Alexandra noticed the shift in him before he spoke about it. The introspection that had once carried weight was giving way to something steadier, less questioning, more listening outward. He was no longer examining whether he had done the right thing. He was examining what responsibility now followed it. One evening, as they walked slowly through their neighborhood, streetlights casting long shapes across the pavement, Alexandra asked him what he was thinking. He told her he feared he had misunderstood the cost of restraint, that he had believed stepping back was enough, that he was beginning to understand that withdrawal, when it becomes symbolic, can be used to reassure rather than challenge. Alexandra listened carefully. She told him something that surprised them both. She admitted that his decision had unsettled her not only because of what he might lose, but because of what it demanded from those closest to him. His courage was no longer abstract. It was relational. It asked her to examine the ways she herself had learned to soften conflict in order to survive creatively. It mirrored her own unfinished questions, and that intimacy of reflection frightened her more than any industry consequence. They talked that night not about strategy but about meaning, about the difference between being quiet and being clear, about how humility, when mistaken for disappearance, becomes something else entirely, about how resilience is not simply endurance, but the willingness to remain visible without performance. Alexandra told him she believed the world had grown comfortable with his gentleness because it never asked anything of them. Now that it did, they were trying to reshape it into something harmless again. Keanu did not respond immediately. He was absorbing a truth he had lived inside without naming. He had spent a lifetime avoiding the center. Now he was discovering that sometimes refusing the center was precisely what allowed it to remain unchanged. The turning point did not arrive through industry pressure or personal loss. It came through someone who had nothing to gain. At a small gathering unrelated to his career, a young man approached him, nervous but deliberate. He introduced himself as a former intern who had left the industry quietly, ashamed not because he had failed, but because he had stayed silent in rooms where he felt something was wrong. He told Keanu that seeing someone with everything to lose choose discomfort over alignment had forced him to re-examine his own choices. His voice trembled not with fear, but with relief. For the first time, he said, he felt permission to value his own integrity over approval. That conversation followed Keanu long after it ended. It clarified something months of introspection had not. Impact was not measured by scale. It was measured by sincerity. He did not need to persuade those who already benefited from the way things were. He needed to validate those who had been taught their discomfort was irrelevant. That realization altered the internal conflict that had been exhausting him. The doubt softened. The fear receded. What remained was resolve, quieter but denser than before. He was no longer concerned with how his decision was perceived. He was concerned with whether it was being lived fully. Alexandra saw the change immediately. The tension that had hovered around him eased, replaced by a steadiness she recognized from his earliest creative periods. He was not seeking confirmation anymore. He had accepted ambiguity as part of the cost of coherence. One night, sitting together without distraction, Alexandra told him she finally understood why his decision had unsettled her so deeply. It was not because she feared what he might lose. It was because his clarity forced her to confront the ways she too had learned to navigate injustice gently rather than directly. His courage reflected her own unfinished work. That admission brought them closer than reassurance ever could. They spoke openly then, not about consequences, but about purpose. About respect not as an abstract value, but as a daily practice. About humility not as self-erasure, but as accurate placement of oneself in relation to others. About kindness not as silence, but as the courage to interrupt what quietly harms. Outside their home, the industry was beginning to respond more visibly. Articles hinted at his absence. Commentators speculated about relevance. None of it was overtly hostile, that was its effectiveness. It allowed everyone to feel reasonable while discouraging imitation. But beneath that surface, conversations were shifting. Questions once dismissed were being revisited. Meetings felt different. Jokes landed less easily. The silence Keanu had stepped into was no longer empty. It was echoing. And as those echoes grew, one truth became unavoidable. Standing still had not removed him from the story. It had shifted the perspective from which it was being told. The next phase would demand something different. Not sacrifice, not explanation, presence. Not the kind that dominates, but the kind that refuses to disappear. The kind that makes silence honest instead of useful. The kind that reminds people that humility is not invisibility, and that sometimes the most disruptive act is not to leave a room, but to remain inside it without surrendering your alignment. The reckoning did not arrive as a dramatic turning point. There was no confrontation, no viral moment, no public reversal. Instead, it unfolded the way real transformations always do, gradually, almost invisibly, like a tide that reshapes a shoreline long before anyone notices the water has moved. By the time Keanu sensed that something around him was changing again, he understood that this phase would be the most demanding. Not because it asked him to give something up, but because it asked him to remain, to stay present without reassurance, to endure without applause, to live inside the tension of unfinished outcomes. The initial shock of his decision had passed. The discomfort it created had settled. Now came the quieter, more exhausting work of allowing consequences to reveal themselves honestly. What surprised him most was not how many people withdrew, but how many began to speak differently. Not loudly, not publicly, but sincerely. A producer asked in private whether a meeting really needed to exclude the people it always excluded. A writer admitted uncertainty about a system they had once defended reflexively. A junior staff member chose not to laugh at a joke that relied on humiliation to land. None of these moments would ever trend. None of them would ever be credited to him, yet together they formed something unmistakable, a subtle pattern of awareness that could not easily be undone. Keanu watched it unfold without claiming ownership. He understood that real change rarely announced itself. It revealed itself in tone, in hesitation, in questions people finally allowed themselves to ask. At home, Alexandra felt the storm she had feared was not destroying them, but reshaping them. The anxiety that once accompanied his decision had not vanished, but it had transformed. It no longer hovered like an impending loss. It lived instead as a deeper attentiveness to the life they were building. Their conversations had grown more deliberate, less automatic. They spoke not only about schedules and projects and the ordinary mechanics of living, but about alignment. About what kind of presence they wanted to embody. About how easily creativity could coexist with compromise if it was never examined. Alexandra admitted one evening that watching Keanu remain steady without reinforcement had forced her to reconsider her own relationship with visibility. She had long accepted being underestimated as the cost of creative freedom. Now, she wondered whether that bargain had protected her, or whether it had simply delayed difficult conversations with herself. Keanu listened, aware that his decision had never belonged only to him. Integrity, once practiced openly, asked reflection from everyone nearby. Sandra found herself unexpectedly positioned between worlds. Her career still placed her inside rooms Keanu no longer entered, and with that access came responsibility she did not take lightly. When his name surfaced framed with polite skepticism or softened concern, she redirected the tone without turning it into a battle. She refused to let his values be reframed as impracticality or detachment. She did not defend him loudly. She normalized him. She spoke of him the way one speaks of a standard, not an exception. And in an industry built on exaggeration, that act alone carried quiet power. Over time, she noticed something shift. People stopped joking. They started asking what he meant, why he had done it, what it required, questions that were not yet commitments but were no longer dismissals. The most revealing moment came when Keanu was invited, not publicly and not ceremoniously, into a private discussion about reform within a creative organization he had supported for years. There were no cameras, no announcements, no assurances that anything would change. Only a room of people who had realized that ignoring discomfort had not made it disappear. Keanu accepted the invitation without expectation. He entered not as a representative of anything, but as a participant in a conversation that could easily fail. When he spoke, he did not lecture. He did not persuade. He clarified. He spoke about respect not as a slogan, but as a daily practice. About humility not as self-erasure, but as accurate awareness of one's position in relation to others. About resilience not as enduring harm quietly, but as refusing to normalize it. He spoke carefully, not to be convincing, but to be precise. When the meeting ended, there was no applause, no declaration, no sense of resolution. What followed instead was a different kind of silence, thoughtful, uneasy, reflective, the kind that appears when something has been named that cannot easily be unnamed. As Keanu left the room, he did not feel victorious. He felt aligned, and alignment, he was learning, did not thrill, it steadied. That night, returning home, he noticed the calm that had been growing quietly within him. Not relief, not certainty, but coherence. The fear that had accompanied his decision months earlier had transformed into acceptance. Some doors were closed, some connections had thinned, but something else had taken their place. A sense that his actions no longer required translation, that he was no longer negotiating between who he appeared to be and who he was practicing becoming. Alexandra saw it immediately. In the way he moved, in the way he listened, in the way his presence filled rooms without asking permission. She realized then that he had not withdrawn from the world, he had stopped performing for it. They spoke late into the night, not about what might happen next, but about what had already changed. Alexandra told him that his stillness had altered her understanding of courage, that she had once believed bravery meant endurance. She now believed it meant accuracy, seeing things as they were, naming them without cruelty, refusing to let familiarity excuse harm. Keanu told her he had once believed humility meant not taking up space. He now believed it meant not misusing it. Their words did not resolve anything, they grounded it. Outside their home, some doors remained closed, some relationships never returned to what they had been. But something essential had shifted. Conversations felt different, absences were noticed, silences were questioned. The world around him had not transformed, but it had adjusted. An adjustment, when it spreads, is the earliest form of change. Keanu understood then that the decision that had shocked Sandra and unsettled Alexandra was never meant to create a moment. It was meant to create a condition, a way of existing that did not rely on approval to remain intact. He had not chosen disruption. He had chosen consistency. And consistency, when lived long enough, quietly rearranges the rooms it occupies. What remained was not triumph. It was responsibility, to continue living what he had named, to resist both retreat and performance, to stay, to listen, to respond when clarity demanded it, to allow kindness to be guided by courage instead of comfort. The story was not ending, it was deepening, and whatever followed would not arrive with spectacle. It would arrive the way all lasting things do, through presence practiced daily, through relationships reshaped honestly, through a man once known for silence learning what it meant to let that silence carry weight. By the time the 5th month unfolded, the world around Keanu had settled into a new shape, one that felt neither hostile nor welcoming, but conditional. The overt discomfort had passed. The quiet recalibration had completed itself. What remained was a landscape in which he was still respected, still spoken of warmly, but no longer automatically included. He existed in proximity to the industry rather than within its inner current. And while he had anticipated the professional consequences of his decision, what he had not fully prepared for was the way integrity would begin to test the most intimate parts of his life. Not through argument, not through division, but through exposure. It revealed what could no longer remain vague. Alexandra felt this exposure first in herself. The stability she and Keanu had cultivated had always been grounded in mutual independence, in two lives that converged without consuming one another. Now, his choice had introduced a different kind of gravity into their shared world. It was not drama, it was direction. Their future was no longer assumed. It was being actively shaped, and that required questions she could no longer postpone. One evening, as they worked in the same room in quiet parallel, Alexandra set her tools aside and told him she needed to speak, not because something was wrong, but because something was becoming clearer. She told him that loving someone who refused compromise did not simply inspire admiration. It demanded examination. It asked her to confront the ways she herself had learned to negotiate her values in order to remain functional in spaces that were not built for them. She admitted that she sometimes feared his clarity would pull her into a life of constant friction, of always standing at edges rather than resting inside circles. Not because she doubted him, but because she was learning how much safety she had unconsciously gathered from invisibility. Keanu listened without interruption. He did not rush to reassure her. He did not frame her concern as doubt. He recognized it for what it was, honesty. He told her that his decision had not come from certainty, but from a refusal to keep carrying questions he no longer believed he could live with. He told her that he did not want her to become someone else in order to stand beside him. He wanted her to become more of herself, even if that meant discovering limits to what they could share. That admission was not easy. It did not strengthen them through romance. It grounded them through respect. They sat with it, letting the words breathe, letting the implications exist without immediately softening them. In that space, Alexandra felt something unexpected, not fear, relief. The relief of being invited not to align, but to articulate. Sandra confronted the cost differently. Where Alexandra examined inwardly, Sandra encountered the collision outwardly. It happened during a closed meeting framed around future collaborations. Keanu's name surfaced indirectly, mentioned as an example of someone taking time. The phrase was gentle. The implication was not. Sandra recognized the moment immediately. A narrative was being cemented. Keanu's decision was being archived into something safe, something personal, something disconnected from ethics. And if that narrative held, the discomfort he had introduced would be neutralized. Sandra did something she had rarely done in such spaces. She interrupted the framing, calmly, without edge. She asked what exactly taking time meant. She asked whether stepping away from conditional environments was now being categorized as indecision. She asked whether reflection only counted when it did not challenge existing structures. The room did not resist her. That was what made it significant. The room paused. People answered carefully. Some admitted they were unsure. Others acknowledged that discomfort had indeed played a role. No one argued, but the narrative did not proceed unexamined. And Sandra understood then that loyalty, when practiced with clarity, could open conversations that admiration never could. When she told Keanu about the meeting later, she did not dramatize it. She told him that his decision was no longer being dismissed. It was being negotiated. And negotiation, she said, meant it had entered the realm of consequence. Keanu absorbed that with the same steady composure that had come to define him. He did not feel vindicated. He felt accountable. His stillness was no longer a personal act. It was a relational one. It touched the choices of others. And that meant it required maintenance. He began spending more time in the spaces he had once supported quietly. Community rooms, creative workshops, conversations without hierarchy, not to lead, not to represent, but to remain reachable. In those environments, his absence from prestige mattered little. What mattered was consistency, that he returned, that he listened, that he remembered names, that he did not confuse presence with performance. One afternoon, sitting with a group of young creatives who spoke candidly about their experiences navigating unspoken rules, Keanu realized something that settled deeply within him. He was no longer motivated by whether he belonged. He was motivated by whether the space itself was becoming more honest. And that shift reoriented his understanding of success entirely. Alexandra noticed how this steadiness was changing him. He was quieter but not withdrawn, more deliberate but not guarded. The tension she had once feared was transforming into something more sustainable, not peace, but congruence. And congruence, she discovered, had its own kind of calm. Still, the personal cost did not disappear. It simply clarified. Some friendships faded without drama. Some invitations never returned. Certain futures they had once imagined loosened at their edges. Alexandra felt grief for those soft losses, even as she respected the integrity that caused them. She told Keanu one night that she was learning grief did not always arrive with heartbreak. Sometimes it arrived as a gentle release of what no longer fit. Keanu told her that he had once believed resilience meant enduring quietly. He was learning that it also meant letting go accurately, letting the world respond, letting relationships reveal their true tolerances, letting himself be shaped not by applause but by alignment. And as he spoke, Alexandra understood that loving him did not mean following his direction. It meant standing within her own and allowing those directions to remain in conversation. The most unexpected effect of his decision was not the doors that closed. It was the questions that remained open. People were no longer certain how to categorize him, and in that uncertainty, a new possibility existed. He was not a symbol of harmless kindness. He was not an icon of quiet endurance. He was becoming something less useful to systems built on image and more useful to people searching for coherence. And that shift, he realized, was irreversible. By the end of that month, Keanu no longer felt as though he were waiting for something to happen. Something had already happened, not externally, internally. He had crossed from decision into practice, and practice, unlike moments, demanded constancy. It demanded that he continue to choose alignment when it was unremarkable, that he continue to disappoint expectations when they required his silence, that he continue to make space without withdrawing from it. The cost was no longer theoretical. It was relational, emotional, ongoing, and he was no longer measuring whether it was worth it. He was living as if it already was. The final realization did not arrive as triumph. It did not arrive with recognition, apology, or public acknowledgement. It arrived quietly the way all lasting truths do, not as a conclusion, but as a condition Keanu found himself living inside. By the time the 6th month turned, he no longer felt as though he were in the aftermath of a decision. He was inside its reality. The world around him had not reversed course. Certain doors remained closed. Some conversations never returned. The industry had not dramatically transformed, but something more subtle and far more enduring had occurred. The meaning of his presence had changed. He was no longer orbiting structures. He was inhabiting values, and that distinction reshaped everything that followed. What surprised him most was how little he thought about what he had stepped away from. The initial ache had softened into perspective. The absence of certain opportunities no longer registered as loss so much as alignment. He did not feel diminished. He felt clarified. The constant negotiation that once lived quietly beneath his choices had receded. He was no longer calibrating himself against expectation. He was responding to circumstance as it actually was. And in that shift, a different kind of freedom emerged. Not the freedom of limitless options, but the freedom of coherence. His actions and his ethics were no longer in conversation. They were in agreement. Alexandra felt this change not in words, but in atmosphere. The man beside her was not lighter, he was steadier. There was a difference. Lightness depends on conditions. Steadiness generates its own. The unease she had once felt had transformed into something deeper and more durable. Respect without romance. Love without illusion. She saw now that his decision had not narrowed his world. It had refined it. Their relationship no longer floated on the comfort of assumed futures. It rested on something stronger, chosen presence. She told him one evening that she realized his refusal to compromise had not made their life smaller. It had made it truer. It had removed the vague promises and replaced them with lived direction. And direction, she said, was something she could stand within without disappearing. They spoke then about legacy, not in terms of reputation, but in terms of residue. What remained in rooms after one left them? What lingered in conversations after one stopped speaking? What people felt permitted to examine after witnessing someone refuse the convenient answer? Alexandra understood that the most powerful effect of his decision had not been the attention it attracted or the discomfort it created. It was the permission it gave, permission to pause, to question. To resist the seduction of ease when ease came at the cost of accuracy. And as she spoke, Keanu recognized that this permission extended to her as well. She was no longer quietly negotiating herself into spaces that dulled her voice. She was occupying her own work with a sharper authorship. His decision had not instructed her. It had confronted her, and she had met that confrontation honestly. Sandra reached her own resolution differently. It arrived not through one defining conversation, but through accumulation, through months of redirecting rooms, of refusing narratives that softened truth, of normalizing clarity where ambiguity had once protected comfort. She began to notice that Keanu's name no longer surfaced with the same careful distance. People spoke of him less as a curiosity and more as a reference point, not admiration, orientation. When ethical conversations arose, his absence was not dismissed. It was considered. That subtle shift told her something important. His decision had crossed from personal to contextual. It had become part of how people measured situations, even when he was not present. And that, Sandra understood, was how influence actually functioned. Not through visibility, through incorporation. When she shared this with him, Keanu did not react with satisfaction. He felt responsibility. He knew that becoming a reference point carried its own danger. It could be aestheticized, it could be reduced, it could be performed. And so he resisted the temptation to solidify himself into any position others could consume easily. He remained where he had always been most honest, in rooms without hierarchy, in conversations without spectacle. In choices that did not require agreement to remain intact. His decision, he realized, was not meant to be remembered. It was meant to be practiced. Daily, without witnesses, without momentum, without the assurance that it was accumulating into anything recognizable. The moment that confirmed this understanding came during an ordinary afternoon at a creative space he had been visiting regularly. There were no announcements, no special guests, just people working, sharing, navigating their own uncertainties. As he listened to a group speak candidly about the quiet pressures they felt to adapt themselves in order to remain viable, Keanu realized something that completed the internal arc he had been walking. His decision had not been about refusing a system. It had been about refusing the version of himself that system required. And in refusing that version, he had made room for others to imagine alternatives to their own. Not through instruction, through presence. He had not stepped away from the world. He had stopped mirroring it. That night, returning home, he felt a calm that did not depend on outcome. Not relief, not hope, acceptance. The acceptance of unfinished work, of uneven progress, of partial shifts, of doors that might never reopen, of futures that would remain unimagined, and within that acceptance there was no bitterness, only clarity. He understood then that resilience was not the ability to withstand harm. It was the ability to remain truthful without reward. To live as though alignment mattered even when it produced no applause. To continue choosing integrity when it no longer felt dramatic, when it simply felt normal. Alexandra watched him move through their home, unremarkable in the most meaningful way, not burdened, not elevated, simply present. And she realized that this was the legacy of his decision, not a moment, a manner, a way of existing that did not separate kindness from courage or humility from accountability, a way of standing that neither retreated nor dominated, a way of inhabiting space without surrendering shape. She told him quietly that she believed this was the truest version of resilience she had ever witnessed, not the kind that survives storms, the kind that alters climate. The story did not end with justice served neatly or lessons universally learned. Some relationships never returned. Some spaces remained unchanged. The world was still complex. Power still organized itself quietly. Discomfort still sought refuge in language, but something essential had shifted, not just around Keanu, within him, and within the people who had watched, uncertain at first, then attentive, then unable to unsee what his stillness had revealed. In choosing to stand where he was, Keanu had forced movement elsewhere. In refusing spectacle, he had created substance. In accepting the loneliness that sometimes accompanies integrity, he had discovered its opposite. Connection without performance, respect without transaction, purpose without permission. And in that, the decision that once shocked Sandra Bullock and unsettled Alexandra Grant became something else entirely. Not a disruption, a foundation, a quiet, living reminder that humility is not silence, that kindness is not compliance, and that resilience is not endurance alone, but the courage to live truthfully even when certainty never arrives. And that, more than any recognition or restoration, became the shape of a different legacy.